Here comes a catalyst and connector at Good Market. Please welcome to the stage Amanda Kiessel.
Can I stand here? Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Great. I am so happy to be here with all of you today. And I'm going to start with a few slides that are going to feel really familiar, just a couple that will feel, if you've been here from yesterday, this will feel familiar. The key point here is that we are currently living in an economic story that's not working for us, right? It's a story that we humans created, and it's at the root of most of the challenges we're facing today. It's a story that tells us that our purpose is to maximize profits, it's to accumulate capital, it's to grow, 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 and it's not working, right? It's the root cause of the climate crisis, of biodiversity loss, of so many conflicts we're facing, poverty, hunger, inequality, so many of the challenges we're facing. This is the root cause. But the reason that we're all gathered here is because we see that there's a new economic story that's starting to emerge, right? It's a story that we're all creating. We're all kind of co-creating together. And we're already in a situation where we have millions of enterprises and individuals around the world who are living according to a new story and new rules, right? So if the old story is that our purpose is to accumulate capital and grow, the new story says, no, we're going to figure out how can we all thrive together? How can we all be okay together within planetary boundaries? And if the old story says purpose of business is to maximize short-term profits for private shareholders, the new story says, no, our purpose is we're going to figure out how do we prioritize people and planet, right? How do we make the world a better place? So the key thing that I just want to share here is that we know this is coming, but we can't see the full scale of this movement yet because it's still fragmented. We're building this bottom up, and we use different terminology in different places, right? We have, if you're working on a different problem or an issue, you might have your own community. If you're working in a sector, whether it's fashion or energy, you might have your own community. We're registered in different ways. We have different certifications. We have language differences across countries. So we can't fully see it yet, but it's coming up. It's coming bottom up. And normally, this is where I would tell the story about Good Market. So that's the organization that I work with. Good Market, it started in Sri Lanka. It's a digital commons, it's software, shared software for our movement to make everyone more visible, to make it easier for all of us to find and connect. There are now about 3,500 enterprises and networks on it across 107 countries or so, 20 plus languages. And it's a fun story, right? If anybody's interested, I'm happy to share it later. It's a fun story. It's a rah, 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 we're gonna be okay story. But it's not what I wanna talk to you about today. We are here together with a group that deeply understands where we currently are, right? We know that it's not working. And we're also with a group that knows what we're trying to get to, right? A prosumer economy. An economy for the common good. We need to get inside the donut, right? We want to move towards a well-being economy or whatever word is working for you, right? And we know part of how we're getting there. We're here talking about fair trade enterprises, social enterprises, post-growth enterprises, steward-owned companies, all these different things. But the question is, how do we go from the voluntary choices at a personal level, at an organizational level, how do we go from that to changing the story and the rules at a system level, right? That's what I want to talk about today. Because the reality is we don't have much time. And there are some really powerful vested interests involved. And not all of them are just going to change voluntarily, right? I think we can kind of feel it right now. There's all these climate pledges and ESG targets, and they're not being met. Extraction is accelerating. We're seeing the resources that we want to use for a just transition instead going to a war that's just multiple wars that are just heartbreaking. They're destroying things instead of helping us transition, right? We don't have much time. So if we want to speed up this transition, we have to understand how our society works. How do complex systems work? This is a question I've been kind of embarrassingly obsessed with for about, say, the last 25 years, right? It's something I've looked at both through research and through practical experience from ecology work, ecosystem work, social systems, economic systems. It's something I've worked on in Asia and globally. So this is something I deeply, deeply care about. And the thing is when we're dealing with a complex adaptive system, like our socioeconomic system, it's not something that can be predicted or controlled, right? It makes it hard to work with. But there are patterns, and if we understand the patterns, it's easier to find leverage points that we can use to speed up change. So what I want to do today is share some patterns, some pictures that I have found useful in my work, and I want to share them with you in the hopes that it might be useful for your work. So no good market story. Instead, we're going to do this. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Good. So we need to start with how we think about change. And I love this picture because it really sums up an experience that I had with a lot of my colleagues in Sri Lanka, right? I was working with a local organization that was social mobilization, community organizing, with self-sustaining models. And then we had a tsunami, and then the war started again. And there was this huge wave of international aid agencies that came into the country. And the way they understood change, how does change happen, was very different from my colleagues and from the community groups that we worked with, right? They were working from a linear paradigm. So you put in inputs, you put in activities, you're going to get these outputs, and then that comes to these the outcomes and the impacts. It's all predetermined, it's planned, you have a whole timeline that it has to happen in. And this is all while the country were dealing with a war and displaced people and terrorist attacks and economic crises. And so I think for a lot of the people I was working with, it's like, this isn't really actually how the world doesn't work like that. It'd be nice if it did, but it doesn't work like that. If you've ever had to write a business plan or a project proposal or a theory of change, this might feel a little bit familiar. So a linear paradigm, it's useful if you're trying to manufacture a car or build a house or something like that. But when we're talking about how to have change in a complex system like an ecological system, socioeconomic system, it's not quite as useful, right? In a linear paradigm, we think change is predictable and controllable. We think in hierarchies. We think it's universal. What works in one place is going to work everywhere. We think about expert knowledge. So there's groups that maybe they're developed and they're going to develop everyone else. And we wait for them to come in and find solutions and solve the problems. And we think that there can be a fixed plan, right? And the reality is we are actually in a complex system. There's no external planner or expert. We're all part of the system. And innovation can come from anywhere, right? It can come from Turkey, it can come from Sri Lanka. It doesn't just come from London and Washington, D.C. and places like that. Innovation comes from everywhere, right? And most of the time, the best solutions are coming from the people who are the closest to the problem. That's where the energy is. So when we're looking at things with a complexity lens, we know that context matters. We know change comes from anywhere. We know it can't be predicted. It can't be controlled. And in fact, when we try to do top-down efforts to try to have change, most of the time we get unexpected outcomes, things we don't always really want, right? And the thing about paradigms like this, right? And this is a paradigm that's deeply embedded in Western education, and colonial education, right? The thing about this is they're deep. So it's even if you know that we're dealing with this situation, we're dealing with a complexity situation, it's really easy to go back to the old mental models, the old ways of thinking about things, right? And we'll see this like, there's sometimes a subconscious thing that people will think, oh, the solutions are gonna come from the West, and they're gonna then be distributed to other countries, right? It slips back in, even from people who understand this concept. And if anything, it probably should go the other way, because the people that are closest to traditional cultures or indigenous practices often are the ones who kind of remember how do we navigate complexity and these kinds of systems. So if we know that we can't predict and we can't control, how do we have change? And how do we speed it up, right? That's the big question here. I'm just gonna share just one picture. I don't have a slide, but a picture that helped me, right? If you think of us as being in a really fast-moving river, the linear paradigm wants to pretend that we are in a fossil fuel-powered powerboat and that we can go whatever direction we want, however we want. And the complexity paradigm is like, yeah, no, we're actually in a raft or a kayak or something like that, and we're going downstream. We can't control that, right? We can't control the current. But if we're watching and we're seeing how the river is flowing, we can find times to stick in our paddle or our oar and shift in a different direction, right? So that's what we're talking about now. It's a different way of thinking about how change happens. So I'm just gonna share a few more pictures. This is something it comes from what's called agent-based modeling, right? It's something that researchers use to try to understand how these systems work. They're not using it to try and predict the system because they know that they can't be predicted or controlled, but they're trying to figure out what are the patterns, right? I've seen these used for understanding social movements, neural networks, the internet, ecosystems, things like that. So you don't need to have the actual modeling software. You don't have to do agent-based modeling for this to be useful. The point here is that there's a pattern, right? They try to understand first, who are the agents? So in a complex system, an agent is anything that can respond to feedback and change over time. So that's your first question. Who are the agents? If we're talking about our brain, the agents would be the neurons. If we're talking about our human society, it might be people, right? So the agents would be all of us. We're the agents, we're the people. Then the next thing is about the links. What is the relationship between the agents, right? This is about, it could be things like, how do we influence each other? How do we share information? How do resources flow? How do we trade things, right? So this is just as important as the people. What is the relationship between the people? The next thing is the rules. That's the background color, right? That could be, it's what influences how the agents behave. And sometimes that can be really informal things, like our culture or our mental models or the stories we tell ourselves, the social norms. Sometimes it's the really official stuff, like actual legal systems and policies and things like that. So we have to understand the rules. So normally it's really those three things, but I put change separately to remind us that my picture's not that great. It should be a video, right? Because everything is constantly moving. The agents are acting and interacting and the relationships are forming and the rules are constantly changing. It's all the time moving. And that's what makes this so challenging, right? There are leverage points that might have worked in the past that we've used, but now the context is different, so they might not be as useful now. And we can talk later if you want examples or anything like that, but it's important to remember this is constantly moving. So if we're thinking about it for our own work, we want to think, what are the agents that are relevant for what I'm trying to solve, for what I'm working on, right? And what are the relationships that really matter? What are the rules that are shaping the things that I really care about? And this isn't a one-time thing because everything's changing. So you have to keep doing this process over and over again. So I mentioned that Good Market, for example, is trying to increase the visibility of our movement. So the agents that we're caring about, the dots that we care about, are the ones that are working according to the new rules. That's what we're trying to see, right? And that's why the core of the Good Market site is about curation. There's a free curation process. There's a crowdsourced monitoring process. It's about trying to help those agents with the new rules be more visible. The next thing is about connection, right? We want those groups that are already activated to be able to connect with each other. And so the site's designed to recognize and to celebrate the connections happening between people. That could be if you're sharing information, it could be if you're collaborating with each other, it could be that you're trading with each other, whatever it is. But it's about celebrating. Anytime that's happening, we want to encourage people in this space to connect with each other. And when we're going to talk about connection, there's another point that's helpful, another picture from complex adaptive systems. This is called small world networks. It's a network structure. It's very, very common in a lot of complex systems. And the point here is that most people, most agents, don't have the exact same number of relationships, and the relationships can be different strengths, right? So we have certain types of relationships that are bonding relationships. Those are really strong ties, right? That could be things like, you know, maybe your local group that you're a part of and that you see all the time and you have trust and you have a good relationship with each other. And then that becomes a very safe place to try out new ideas, to test things at your local community. And then we also have what's called bridging relationships. That's the connections in between, right? And those are actually just as important because that's how we spread innovation and new ideas, and it's how we can kind of work together to kind of push for bigger change. It helps if you're trying to have change in a system, you need both. You really want to be thinking about how can I have both the bonding types of relationships and the bridging types of relationships. Right? So again, practical example. It's the reason that in the way the Good Market software is set up, it's to support networks, right? Because they're so important for change. It's why I appreciate the work that so many of the people here are doing, is because they're helping do that. They're helping have these kinds of communities, right? So we need these kinds of bonding spaces because it's where we learn. It's a safe space. It's our tribe, right? And it's also a reminder, it's why we will never have one network for our movement. Because this diversity is important. You know, that we have a lot of creativity. We're all coming with different pieces of the puzzle. Different people are gonna feel like, this is my community in different networks, and that is completely okay, right? We're all bringing different parts. But we have to make sure we're also thinking about the bridging between networks, right? So say within the work that we're doing, if we see different networks have a common leverage point, something that they're both sharing as a problem, then it's about how can they might be different, they might be diverse, they have different interests, but they have this one thing that they're both working on. Then how can we work together on that one problem? How can we use our bridging relationships to work together on shared problems? Or we might have a situation where one network has identified a leverage point for their community, something that's really important to them, and we're able to call on all the other networks, hey, support them, right? This is the time that we all need to move, right? We need to support each other. So there's currently about 170, we're missing a picture here, but that's okay. There's currently about 100, there's pictures of different networks, but there's currently about 170 different networks they're using the site, and it's free for people to use if they want to do more. So this next picture might be one you're familiar with. Is this familiar to anyone? So this is called diffusion of innovation. And that research is about how does change spread through society? So anytime there's a new idea or a new behavior, It starts with innovators and early adopters. They're the first ones, in the system that are kind of taking up a new idea. Right? It doesn't mean you're always, like, say you're an innovator or early adopter in one area. Maybe you were the first one to bring reusable bags to the supermarket. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an innovator or early adopter in another area. Maybe you're really slow to adopt certain technologies, right? So point is any new thing, there are going to be innovators and early adopters that are kind of driving the change. Then there's an early majority, a late majority, and there's what they call laggards, the people who are slow, who don't want to change often, right? So if you're trying to accelerate change, you're trying to speed things up, the key lesson here is we want to focus on making those innovators and early adopters visible, right? We want to help them connect to each other. That's what you guys and the team have done with this conference, right? It's about making them visible, make it easier for them to connect. And the other thing is we want to make it as easy as possible for the early majority to get involved. And we don't actually want to spend too much of our energy trying to fight with the people that don't want change. We want to put our energy on that side, right? That's how movements that have been successful, that's how they speed things up, right? So there's a couple of additional points here that are really important. The one is you see the chasm right there, right? That actually represents what often gets called a tipping point, right? Point here is we don't have to get to 100% of our society to know the news story or care about the news story for change to happen. The pattern that we've seen is that normally if you get to about, they say 10 to 15% of a population that's shifting to the news story, there's a tipping point, and you're really able to start changing the rules at a system level. Right? So we don't have to get to 100% of people. There's this process of tipping points that happen in social systems. And then the other piece there is that's kind of a point to remember is the importance of language. So if we're really trying to speed this up, we want the idea to spread through the whole society. A really key part of that is coming together around some simple, unifying language. Simple means everyday language that you could say to your grandmother or your aunts or your uncles and everyone knows what you're talking about, not specialized words, right? And the reason that's important is the groups down here, the innovators and early adopters, they tend to use technical language, and that's totally normal, right? Because it's easier, it's faster. If somebody says something is regenerative or resilient, I know what it means. It's a shortcut. I know this is my community. I know what that means, right? So if we want to get the early majority involved, we have to use simple language so they don't feel left out, so that they also feel that they're welcome, that it's easy for them to get involved. And the other thing is if we want these groups to start working together, to have more bridging connections, we have to find some simple words that work across, that multiple networks can be like, yeah, okay, I'm okay with that simple language, right? So we want people, when they hear it, they feel like, yeah, okay, we're diverse, but I'm okay with that. That works for me, right? So the last picture, maybe I'll just give one example of that. This was the session that we just had in the other room. This is an example of trying to find simple language so that networks can work together. There is a verification that came up through a network of networks, and when it first started, it was called SEWF, Verified Social Enterprise. And it didn't work, right? It used a lot of technical language. It didn't feel quite right to people, but because they were doing it through a network of networks, they got feedback. And people said, actually in Hungary, this doesn't really work, or in Ethiopia, this doesn't really work for us. And they decided together to make the language simple. The language for the standards, the language for the badge, to make it simple. And that made it possible that now it's taking off. It's not just social enterprises, there's cooperatives, and there's all different types of enterprises that are getting involved. So this is a good example of when we use simple language, it's easier to connect together, we can get more groups to start coming in, we can start to shift things. And this is the last picture I wanted to share. This is a closer look at what we call a tipping point, right? The technical name, as they talk about it, is a phase transition. And the actual point where it shifts is called a critical point, right? When something tips. So if you think of A1, that first picture, that's our dominant system, our dominant economic system. And A2 is our new economic story that many of us here are working on, right? These two things can coexist in society. We can have some people working according to a new story and some people with an old story, and that can exist for a long time, right? And it might never shift or change. But if the contradictions start getting too strong within the old system, right? And if the new system is, actually getting really organized, if there's a point where the system becomes unstable, which often happens during periods of crisis, and the old story isn't working anymore, you can have a whole shift to the new system. So it's important to remember it can go slow, 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 and then quick, right? The transition to the next phase, that happens pretty quickly. But it doesn't happen automatically. There's no guarantee. Just because we're in that second one right now, we're not guaranteed that we're going to get to this new system, right? And we can see that from other times of crisis. You can see from the Occupy Wall Street movement or Arab Spring or the protests after the murder of George Floyd, right? It doesn't just happen automatically. Just because the system is unstable, we don't automatically shift to the better world that all of us want, right? And so the way we're trying to speed that up is what we've already been talking about. It's doing all the groundwork. It's about organizing, collaboration, building alliances. It's about taking a whole diversity of networks and being able to come together around a simple story that we can share with everyone, right? We need to have examples. We need lots of examples of the new system in practice so it doesn't feel scary. We've already got, we can point. There's an example, right? Those are the things that when a crisis comes, if we've done that groundwork, it is easier to shift. And we have a really useful example of this from the last century. So we often talk about our current system, which is a hyper-accelerated system that gets called neoliberalism. We talk about it as if it started in the 1980s with Reagan and Thatcher and all of the whole deregulation, as if it started then. But that's just the point that we reached the critical point when we saw the transition. The actual work of it started back in the 1940s. So the picture on the left is a photo from a meeting. Maybe some of you know about this, right? A meeting in 1947 what became called the Mont Pelerin Society. And you had all these economists. It was Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and George Stigler and all these economists. And they didn't want any collectivism. Their story that they wanted is everything is about maximizing profits. The purpose of a business is to maximize profits for shareholders, and that's it, nothing else. And we should shrink all government programs. That was the story that they were trying to shift things through. And they spent years going on TV programs, writing articles in popular paper, building alliances, building up examples that they'd be able to show. And they laid all this groundwork. And then in the early 1970s, when there was a crisis, there was an oil crisis, there was stagflation, they called it, they had everything ready. It tipped, right? So even though this is a source of a lot of pain that many of us are experiencing right now, it's an important lesson. It's a lesson we can use, that we can learn from, right? And I just want to close off with this image because it's a reminder of how change happens. This is a line from a Spanish poem, "We make the road by walking." And the key thing here is instead of clinging to the leverage points that worked for us in the past, right? There's certain things around, we had good experiences with street protests or certain types of policy change in the past. Instead of just holding on to that, we need to learn by doing. We need to really observe the system right now and figure out the points that we can intervene to speed things up. There's no roadmap. because there's no road. We make the road by walking, right? So those are the pictures I wanted to share. I'm here for any questions, and I can tell the Good Market story later if anybody's interested. But because of this group, I wanted to share this.
Thank you, Amanda. We have 5 minutes, so we can have 1 or 2 questions if you have any. Tansu will pass the microphone.
Amanda, thanks very much for your visionary and eye-broadening speech. My question is, while you were explaining the agent-based model, you, under the rules category, you put the mind shift, the mindset, and the rules in one category.
That's right.
Usually, the mindset creates the rules.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, why did you put them in together?
Yeah,
Thank you.
A really good question. So the way when they're actually making the software models, they think of rules as just one category. What influences behavior, right? And I think it's really important for us to remember that when we're talking about rules in our society, not all of them are the formal policies. They're not just government policies or big institutional policies. Some of the rules aren't even written down. It's our mental model, it's our culture, it's the social norms. This is the right thing to do, or this is what I was always taught, right? So the rules of how we behave, we've got official rules like policies, and we've also got these informal rules. But you're 100% right, and I didn't mention that. I don't think we've got any examples from history where we have changed the official rules without having a big change in our mindset and our story first. This is not something where the government is going to come in and do some enlightened policy, right? It's going to come from all of us, right? It's about shifting that story and shifting that mindset, and you're right, that comes first, and then changing official policies and rules come after that.
Else who has a question? Okay, so we had 2 more minutes, but if nobody has any questions, I think we can get to the coffee break.
Yeah, and I'm here, so if anyone has anything else they want to talk about, I'm happy to talk to you.
And after the break, we have the session with Ece Satıcı on Prosumer Economy here. And in Cinema Room A, we will have a panel on the power of social enterprises for economic transformation, in which Amanda Kiessel will be a panelist. Thank you.